Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerVIP.com. Welcome to part 2 of this series entitled Defending Blinds Postflop. In the first part we looked at situations where we cold call from the blinds and we're facing a c-bet from the original raiser. In this part we're going to look at situations where the original raiser does not c-bet and instead checks back, and we want to figure out what the best line is on the turn. Firstly, why is it important that we consider this specific situation? It's generally going to be one of the most profitable situations we can face when defending from the blinds as a cold caller. In very many situations, when our opponent checks back as the pre-flop raiser, we can assume that his range is capped, and our immediate reaction should be, how can I get my opponent to fold? There's three lines we may potentially be using. We may think about using irregular sizing and double barreling. We may think about overbetting the turn, and we may also think about underbetting the turn in some situations. Today we're going to review some hands in this situation, and we're going to discuss which of these three options is going to be the best. Many players realize that they should be playing aggressively in this situation when the pre-flop raiser checks back, but they don't really understand how to evaluate which of these lines is going to be the best. Before we begin, I'd like to show you a graph. It's only over a very small sample. I filtered, I think, maybe 15,000 hands or so for situations where we defended from the blinds and our opponent decides to check back. Even though the sample size is quite small, we should be able to see that there is a clear trend going on here. We're not necessarily making huge amounts of money with our showdown winnings, our blue line, but we're making a ton of money with our red line. This is because our opponent's range is typically very weak when he checks back, or at the very least capped, and we can very frequently get him to fold the majority of his range by the river. In order to make the very best decisions in this specific situation after the pre-flop raiser checks back, it's very important to be able to analyze exactly what someone's check back range is on various board textures. In fact, the reason why this situation is generally so profitable is that when our opponent checks back as a pre-flop raiser, his range is generally something very specific. When you think about the average player at the lower limits, they're generally going to be open raising quite wide, and their c-bet stat is probably going to vary somewhere between about 60% and potentially even 90% or more. So when a player is c-betting very frequently, there must be a very specific reason why they decide to check back. In many cases, it's going to be a hand that has some kind of showdown value but wants to pot control, i.e. a hand that doesn't necessarily want to play for three streets. An example of such a hand may be pocket jacks on a king 7-2 rainbow board, or second pair, perhaps something like ace 9 on a jack 9-2 board, a very good second pair that doesn't necessarily want to bet for value, but also doesn't want to bet as a bluff because the hand is strong enough to use as a bluff catcher on the turn and river. The other part of our opponent's checking back range may be absolute garbage that our opponent is giving up. Some players do not actually have these hands in their range because if they have, for example, a c-bet stat of 90% or so, it often means that they're actually just c-betting their garbage as a bluff. Assuming we're playing against someone who's a little bit more balanced, perhaps his c-bet flop stat is closer to 55% or so, we would also expect them to be giving up with the absolute weakest hands in their range, checking back with the intention of folding the turn versus a bet. An interesting imbalance in many players' game at the lower limits is that they c-bet the vast majority of their draws. So it's very unlikely if our opponent has a flush draw on the flop that he's going to be checking back. Even something like a gut shot, straight draw, these are going to get c-bet the vast majority of the time. So if our opponent checks back on a two-tone board, perhaps there's two diamonds out there, and the turn card completes that flush draw, i.e. it's a third diamond, it's very, very unlikely our opponent is going to have a flush in that particular spot, because if he had a flush draw, he would have c-bet the flop. Of course, this is not always true. It's not impossible that our opponent could check back with some of his draws, but the vast majority of the time they're going to be c-betting these hands, so we can heavily discount them from our opponent's turn range, and we can be very aggressive on cards which complete the draws that they would have generally c-bet. In most cases we can usually have those draws in our range, but our opponent cannot have those in his. Another category of hands that nearly always gets continuation bet are the strong made hands, and this is especially true on drawy texture. So if the texture is something like Jack 9-7 with a flush draw, and our opponent has pocket jacks, it's very, very unlikely he's going to check back. We can pretty much assume that he never has that hand in his range and play accordingly, even if some small percentage of the time you'll be playing against a strange opponent who decides that actually he wants to check the hand in that particular spot. This is generally also true on dry textures, but not true as frequently. For example, if our opponent has something like pocket kings on the king 7-2 rainbow, the majority of players at the lower limits will definitely c-bet that hand, but it's a much better spot to slow play in general. So we can assume that a decent opponent is going to have more strong hands in his range when he checks back a dry texture. But for the most part, we can assume that if our opponent does not c-bet, then he does not have a strong made hand, especially at the lower limits where value betting is probably one of the key ways that players are going to make money. There's inherently less value in slow playing against the majority of players at the lower limits. So if our opponent has top set on a dry texture, in most cases it's going to get continuation bet. So in the majority of cases, our opponent's checking back range is going to be capped. The hands that remain are going to be things like second pair type hands, also things like ace high. These are the most common two groups of hands. You will see some draws because it's possible our opponent occasionally checks back a draw. But generally speaking, when an opponent checks back the flop as the pre-flop raiser, he's going to have ace high a whole bunch, and he's going to have some pairs that he wants to pot control with. Most of these hands are going to be folding by the river. Very often ace high may fold to a bet immediately on the turn. Even if it decides to float once, it's very often going to be folding by the river. And the same with most second pair hands. It's going to be very difficult for our opponent to call two streets with these hands. If we think our opponent is the type of player who is going to bluff catch two streets with ace high or some of these second pair type hands, this is when overbetting comes in, because we can put additional pressure on our opponent to fold some of his range that he would think about bluff catching with. So let's elaborate on that topic somewhat. Overbet or regular size. How do we know after opponent checks back the flop, should we overbet the turn or should we think about betting a regular sizing? Both of these are going to be excellent strategies in the majority of cases. If we know our opponent's range is capped, it's very difficult for him to call an overbet in any situation. Having said that, we don't necessarily want to overbet unless it's strictly necessary to do that in order to get our opponent to fold, because we also want to think about concepts such as risk to reward ratio. We want to get the best price on our bluff. So if we can get our opponent to fold for 70% of the pot, there's not really any need for us to bet 150% of the pot. We're getting a worse price on our bluff. However, if our opponent won't fold to the 70% bet, but he will fold to the 150% pot bet, then that's going to be a superior bet. Generally, the answer to this question depends largely on our perceived range. The reason it depends on our perceived range is if we can represent a ton of legitimate value combos, our opponent is going to be much more likely to give us credit. He's going to be much more likely to fold his capped range to two regular size bets. However, if the range that we're representing is very narrow, our opponent is going to be much more tempted to bluff catch us two streets with ace high or a second pair type hand. This is where overbetting comes in. It's a very good spot to force our opponent to fold hands that he may otherwise think about bluff catching with. So generally speaking, the narrower the value range that we represent, the larger our bet sizing should be. From a game theory point of view, this allows us to have more bluffs in our range, which is definitely favorable for us if our value range is legitimately quite narrow in a certain situation. The most common situation that this is going to be true is on a very dry texture, where we can't really have too many things like two pair combos, straights, etc. We're perhaps representing maybe sets and also maybe some top pairs, but maybe not really that many top pairs. If you think, for example, about us cold calling from the big blind against a button open and the flop is king 7-2 rainbow, we can't really represent ace king or king queen that well anymore. So our value range is going to be capped from maybe king jack or king 10 and lower, and then sets, for example, 7s and 2s. So our value range is going to be pretty narrow in that spot. So if our opponent checks back on the king 7-2 rainbow board, and then the turn is a 3, which doesn't really improve our range that much, we don't have that many 3s in our pre-flop range, then it's going to be very tough for us to represent a wide range of value combos. That's the kind of texture where our opponent is going to seriously think about calling us down with ace high, or maybe some kind of second pair hand, or something like pocket jacks, for example. we can two barrel in that spot, but there's a much higher chance we're going to get called. If we overbet, however, then our opponent may think twice about calling with that hand. He may think that maybe we don't overbet very much as a bluff. That's completely possible at the lower limits, and he may give us a lot of credit with some of his hands that would be profitable bluff catchers. For example, something like pocket queens on a king 7-2. You may not get that to fold if we two barrel on blank turn and river cards. However, if we overbet the turn, there's a much higher chance that we're going to get our opponent to fold his hand by the river. So to summarize, if we rep very few value combos, calling down with ace high or second pair may look attractive to villain. That's a good spot to overbet. However, if the board connects quite well with our pre-flop defending range, we can keep our sizing smaller, and we can expect our regular size single barrel or double barrel to elicit a larger amount of folds. We get a better risk to reward ratio on our bluff, so we should make more money in the long run this way. So we've talked about overbetting and we've talked about the regular sizing. So when would it be a good spot to underbet? Underbetting is generally a good idea when we actually think our hand may be good very frequently, and this can be a holding as weak as ace high, maybe even king high. The reason it's okay to underbet in these spots is, firstly, we get an excellent price on our bluff. Secondly, it's not actually a big deal for us if our opponent starts calling really wide, because we actually very likely have the best hand. And the third reason is related to this, in that if we have ace high or maybe have some kind of underpair to the board, we may actually get called by worse hands. Our opponent may decide to call really wide. He may begin to call us with things like draws. He may float us with his queen high or his ace high if we have something like pocket twos. Then we may find that the river goes check check and we actually rake the pot at showdown. Whereas let's say our opponent doesn't adjust his defending range on the turn and he just defends really tight and he folds a whole ton. Even though he's not going to be calling with any worse hands, the fact that he folds so frequently to our small bet means that we're going to make a lot of money in that situation because we're getting an excellent price on our bluff. It's generally good to make sure we imagine our opponent's range to be weak, and against an unknown we probably should assume that their range is quite weak, quite capped, because they decided not to c-bet the flop and they just checked back. But it does depend on the player type. If your opponent has a history of slow playing, for example, then betting the turn with all types of sizing, underbetting, overbetting, regular sizing, it's going to be less profitable in general if our opponent has a tendency to slow play and check back a lot of strong hands on the flop. In some cases, when we have a very good bluff catcher, we can even think about not betting the turn with our showdown value, and we can think about going for a check call on the turn. This is especially true when our bluff catcher is not that vulnerable. So ideally it would be quite a high pair, so there's not too many overcards that can come on the river. Also the turn texture would be quite dry, there wouldn't be too many available draws. So in this case we can think about using a hand as a check call, and it also helps if our opponent is aggressive. Because if our opponent is very passive, then the value of any bluff catchers goes down quite significantly, because what's going to happen is our opponent's not going to bluff, and when he does decide to bet the turn, he's just going to have quite a strong range, and our second pair or our ace high type hand is not going to be a very good bluff catcher. It's going to be behind his range, his entire range in fact. Also, assuming that our bluff catcher is very vulnerable, perhaps it's a very low pair, or perhaps the board texture is quite drawy, then it can be in a lot of situations better to just lead out anyway. There's a much higher chance that we take the pot down directly on the turn and we don't let our opponent see a free river card on a very dangerous texture for us. So in most cases we probably want to actually lead our showdown value hands on the turn when our opponent checks back. If a hand's weak, we can just underbet and think of it as a protection bet. The specific situations where we can check again is when we have a bluff catcher that's not vulnerable, and especially if our opponent is quite aggressive and will bluff quite frequently when we check twice to him. Also, given that we check on the flop to the pre-flop raiser very frequently, including with a bunch of our strong hands, it may be that if our opponent is very aggressive, we may actually still have some very strong hands in our range on the turn that we decide are actually going to check again on the turn to represent a weak range that's giving up, rather than the standard option, which is to lead the turn immediately for value after our opponent checks back the flop. So the two main advantages of the underbet line are that we extract thin value some of the time, and secondly, we prevent our opponent from seeing free river. Okay, so same as before, we're going to try and get through as many of these hands as possible, and all of these hands should be situations where the original opener checks back on the flop. These hands were, some of them played a while back, so I may even change my decision on what is the best line to take. but it should certainly be useful from an analysis point of view. Queen 10 offsuit in the big blind. Hopefully you realise by now that this should be a very standard cold call, especially versus a min raise. Here we actually have some kind of showdown value here, so immediately I'm thinking we may actually find a spot to underbet the turn here if our opponent checks back. Let's think a little bit about his range also, since that's a very important skill in working out what the best turn line is. So imagine your villain. Which hands would you be checking back on a King Queen 4? Well, he is probably going to bet all of his King X hands. He's probably going to bet most of his flush draws, but as mentioned, there's a possibility he checks back some things like flush draws, 10 jack, ace jack, ace 10. It will happen some percentage of the time, but the majority of the time is c-betting those hands. So we're really looking at some kind of pocket pair below a queen. Maybe some of the time he can have some queen x hands as well. He could certainly have queen jack. He's on the button. He can have stuff like queen 5 suited, for example. He may think about calling us down with something like ace queen, especially on this turn card, but the rest of his range is going to be in a pretty tough spot if we are aggressive. However, we don't necessarily need to try and get him to fold, since we do actually have a made hand in this spot. So what we can do is we can think about making a small underbet here. And the advantage of underbetting is, against his premium holdings like ace queen, we lose the least amount of money, whereas we keep his range as wide as possible. We're extracting value from things like 9s, 10s, jacks. Also any draws that he checked back we can get value from. We don't necessarily want to give him a free card to see his draw here. So underbetting the turn here is actually a very good option. And river, I think we should even think about just betting again for value. From things like 9s, 10s, jacks, but it's thin because he can also have things like queen jack, ace queen, etc. So I think I decided to check at the time, but possibly we can think about betting the river here small for value. This hand we have pocket 8s in the small blind, so we're actually playing against an early position open in this hand, but many of the same principles apply. So our opponent decides to check back. He open raises under the gun, so his under the gun open raising range is certainly going to have most of the Broadway hands, especially the suited Broadways, and also some of the big pocket pairs, in particular 10s plus is going to definitely be in his range. He'll also have things like 8s and lower as well. The way we can define his range is we can say that he nearly always is going to c-bet 10s plus here. Players do not check over pairs on the flop. This means his range is very specifically going to be a pocket pair below pocket 8s. He could even have pocket 8s, or he is going to have some Broadway hands like ace king, ace queen, etc. Again, it's a spot where if we didn't have showdown value, we could definitely think about bluffing, trying to get him to fold his range. But because we actually have some showdown value in this spot, it's going to be a pretty good spot to underbet the turn after our opponent checks back. We may even get him to call twice with something like ace queen, or maybe even something like pocket 6s, but this is only going to be true if we bet a very small sizing. River is not a very good card to value bet. I think I decided to check here and not value bet the river. I think I decided getting called by 6s or ace queen on this river is going to be optimistic. I decided to check, and he has queen king, so he has part of the range that we put him on, which is Broadways, that he decides not to c-bet and just check back the flop. So he basically never has 10s plus in his hand, which is a key to playing the hand correctly. He doesn't really ever have 9s, 5s or 3s either. Ace 2 here, standard defend against the min raise. Here we have a gut shot and our opponent checks back. So a lot of his range can easily be things like queens down to pocket 7s in this spot. Pocket 6s too, of course, in which case he's just hit a set. In terms of the kind of value range we can represent by leading, since it's a king high board, we don't really have too much stuff like ace king, king queen, because we would have 3-bet these hands pre-flop. And also the texture is quite a low texture, which means in general we're going to connect with it a little bit less often. It's a little bit harder for us to represent some kind of value range. We certainly can have a value range in this spot, though. We are going to have some king x hands like king jack, king 10, and we're also going to have even things like king 6, king 3, king 5 suited. We can also have things like pocket 5s, pocket 3s, pocket 6s. We can't really have kings because we 3-bet pre-flop. So we certainly can represent some kind of value range in this particular spot. Another factor to consider is, given that we expect a decent chunk of our opponent's range to be pocket 6s through to pocket queens, this is not exactly a scare card for our opponent. If you think about the situation from his position, it's actually quite likely that he will be tempted to call down 2 streets with pocket queens, especially on this particular turn card. Whereas if the turn was something like a queen, then it's going to be much harder for our opponent to call down 2 streets with something like pocket jacks, because the queen is a high card and it's a scare card to a lot of his range. So on this particular turn card, despite the fact we can represent some value combos, we don't represent as many combos as we might do on a different texture. Also, this particular card is not really that scary for our opponent. I think all things considered, this is actually a pretty good spot just to overbet the turn here, just to ensure our opponent folds his ace highs and his pocket eights, etc. Queen 6 suited in the big blind, facing a 2.4x open from the button, should be pretty standard defend. And our opponent checks back on the 10-7-5. So he probably doesn't have any flush draws. He doesn't have any overpairs. He doesn't have any 10x. His most likely holdings at this stage are going to be maybe some good 7x's, but also a whole bunch of ace highs, and then potentially some draws, although we're going to discount heavily any diamond draws. To be honest, it's not that likely, but it's not impossible he has a flush draw or something like 8-9. It will happen from time to time, so don't be completely surprised if your opponent does check back a flush. You have to be aware that it is possible, but for the most part he doesn't have these hands. So I think in this spot I decide to overbet again. It's only a very small overbet. I think this is one spot where we could think about 2-barreling. Although the texture is quite drawy, there's 2 things to say. Firstly, we don't think our opponent has that many draws anyway. And the second thing is, it's not necessarily that bad if our opponent calls with a draw, because if we're going to follow up with a decent amount of river barrels, it's almost as if we're value betting the turn in this particular spot, because provided our opponent's draw does not complete, any money he puts in on the turn, we win on the river when we fire our second barrel. Here I decide to overbet, which I certainly think is a plus EV option, even though we could definitely get away with the regular sizing in this particular situation. King 8 versus an MP open. Probably not a standard call versus a 3x open from MP, but versus a min raise, it's definitely fine to defend this hand. It's actually a very tight fold if we were to fold here, yet I think it's a fold that many of you are actually making on a regular basis. Here our opponent checks back, so again his range is going to be ace high, 10x, pocket 9s, these types of hands. We do actually have some kind of showdown value here, so in this case again I go for an underbet for similar reasons discussed previously. We may actually get called by worse. Our opponent may have picked up a gut shot on this particular turn card, and also we just protect our hand versus any random overcards. Our opponent calls in this case, and the river puts a 4 straight out there, so I think it's okay to give up. It's actually a pretty good spot to fire again, because unless our opponent has a 9x, he can't really call here. I think my preferred option in this spot is to fire the river. And opponent checks back and he has 7-8. So it's okay to check the river given that we have some showdown value, but given that I think we can actually fold out a lot of 10x hands on the river, we also prevent ourselves from being bluffed after we check. I think actually turning a hand into a bluff from this river card is possibly the strongest option. 8-9, we decide to flat call in the small blind. This is perfectly okay. It's a play that many of you will perhaps say is too wide, but it's completely fine to call such hands against a cutoff open. We want to check out the big blind, of course. If the big blind is squeezing a ton, then it may be better for us to 3-bet hand as a bluff, but assuming the big blind's quite passive, it's completely fine to cold call such hands from the small blind versus a cutoff open. Our opponent checks back and the turn card is pretty low, so again it's the kind of spot where we can't really represent that much of a value range. We can have some jack X's, but we may 3-bet some of the better, ace jack. We may even bluff with some things like king jack, queen jack, it's possible. So we don't have that many strong jacks. We obviously can have pocket 3s, and then we can have pocket pairs below a jack, but these aren't necessarily strong value hands. So it's a spot where we know our opponent is capped. He very likely has some kind of ace high or pocket 7s type hand. However, on this particular texture, he's going to be inclined to call down 2 streets with pocket 7s, maybe, especially something like pocket 10s, and potentially even something like ace high. He may think about calling twice with if he has a decent ace high like ace queen, ace king. So definitely a great spot to overbet here, just to try and fold out his entire range. In this particular case, it fails. And I do think we could think about bluffing the river in this spot also. We opt to check fold in this particular hand, but seeing as our opponent is going to be very tempted even to call the turn with some of his stronger pocket pairs, I think the 10 is a reasonable card to maybe even overbet again on the river, just to ensure that our opponent is folding things like pocket 8s. He very rarely has something like a jack X, because he would c-bet the flop. Although, as mentioned, since the texture is dry, it's slightly more plausible he would check back a Jack X. So nothing wrong with the line. It's okay to give up in the river, and I do think the turn overbet here is plus EV. Pocket twos from the big blind. We defend, very standard. Opponent checks back. Here's a spot we can even think about underbetting because we do have some showdown value in this spot. I decided just to turn my hand into a bluff and overbet here, and probably follow up with a decent amount of river barrels in this spot as well, since our opponent can potentially have some gut shots and things with pairs, things like Jack 9, 8 Jack, etc. 10-9. We decide to defend from the big blind. Again, this is a perfectly fine call. It's a call that many of you would not make because you would say that it's perhaps too wide from the big blind against an MP open specifically, but it should be completely fine. Opponent checks back, and again we go for an overbet in this particular case. Would also be fine to bet a regular sizing here and follow up in the river, I think also, but I decided to go for an overbet and it pays off in this case. Queen 10. We defend from the big blind. Should be a pretty standard defend. Our opponent checks back, so again we're talking about things like pocket 9s through pocket queens, some ace high type hands, maybe even some 8x things like 8-9 for example, 10-8, though some guys just c-bet these hands anyway. And again I decided to go for an overbet. It's always nice to have a gut shot as well as backup, and potentially some overcards to our opponent's range as well. So if he has something like 10-8, then our queen out is live. Ace 3 of spades, and we face a 3x open from the cutoff. Again, should be completely fine to defend here by flat calling. As mentioned in the first part of the series, so long as we are thinking about playing aggressively post flop, should definitely be plus EV to play these hands. They're going to flop reasonably well. Look for some spots to check raise, and then of course some guys, even though they are check raising very aggressively post flop, they're not really capitalizing on the situation where the villain checks back. So assuming our opponent checks back on this texture, we can expect him to have things like ace high, maybe pocket 7s, pocket 8s, some 6x hands maybe even some 5x hands, but a lot of these get c-bet. Same with 2s, 3s, 4s. Many players will c-bet these hands anyway on such a texture, but some players will certainly check back these hands with the intention of bluff catching on the turn. I think this particular hand should not be here because I think I check raise here, but it's still an interesting hand nonetheless. I think probably it's a little bit wide to be check raising. I do have a backdoor gut shot here. And this particular opponent, I assumed he'd probably be 3-betting his sets on the flop in this case. I'm not sure why I thought that at the time. Maybe I had some kind of read, because it's perfectly legitimate for him to flat call something like pocket 9s versus my check raise on the flop here. So I decided this is a pretty good turn barrel card to get him off any 9x hands, pocket 10s, jacks, queens, pair plus gutter type hands. Hard for him to continue with 7-8, 9-8, etc. So I figured by the river I'd have a pretty good chance at folding this guy out. So just because we pick up the 3 on the river doesn't necessarily mean that we want to check now for showdown value, because we lose to his entire range anyway. At the very least he has a pair here, but he doesn't have a set that often. He doesn't have 2 pair that often, and he doesn't have things like straights that often either, so it's a pretty good spot just to fire a third barrel here on the river. Okay, last hand, and hopefully this is one when opponent checks back. We have ace 9, again perfectly fine to defend here. Villain looks fishy, he doesn't have a full stack. We could of course think about 3-betting. Again, it depends on the big blind and how aggressive he is. Actually, the big blind looks like he may be a fish here as well, so we're perfectly happy to try and play this pot 3-way. Big blind just folds. Definitely a spot where he should be defending quite wide, because he only needs to add an extra 1 big blind to see a flop here. The flop comes 3-2-2 with a flush draw, and our opponent checks back. We can narrow our opponent's range quite significantly on this particular flop texture, because he's definitely going to be c-betting any pocket pair here. Obviously 3s and 2s for value, and then 4s plus would nearly always c-bet here because he has an overpair, and players don't generally check over pairs. So very often his range is literally just going to be 2 overcards in this particular spot, depending on how wide he opens a cutoff. We don't necessarily always have the best hand, because our opponent can have stuff like ace queen, ace king, but it's very unlikely that our opponent is going to call us down with these hands. In this case I decide to just go for a regular sizing, partly because I think that our ace high is actually good here quite frequently. So long as this opponent is opening the cutoff quite wide, he can certainly have random things like 8-9 of hearts, for example. So it's not necessarily a big deal if we get called here, because we probably just have the best hand. But we certainly could also think about overbetting to make sure we definitely fold out stuff like ace queen, ace king, for example. But we may also just be able to fold out those hands with a 2-barrel anyway. Obviously on the river we just make the nuts here, or very close to the nuts at least. Ace high flush draw, very unlikely we're beaten here. We know our opponent doesn't have pocket jacks, he doesn't have pocket eights. So unless he's slow playing quads or something, or slow playing pocket threes, then we always have the best hand here and should value bet. But it's not that likely our opponent will call anyway, unless he specifically turned a jack with any of the other cards in his range. So he can certainly have a jack. He can have queen jack, king jack, ace jack, 10 jack, jack 9, jack 8 suited even. But he just doesn't hit a jack that frequently. It's much more likely he just has 2 overcards even on the turn here. Okay, so that's it for this 2-part series on playing from the blind as a cold caller. This is obviously only one aspect of blind defense. If you really want to have a solid win rate from the blinds, you need to focus on all the other areas. You need to focus on playing in position from the big blind, for example, against a small blind open. You want to look at playing from the small blind when it's unopened against the big blind. You want to talk about playing in multi-way pots. There's many areas that you need to focus on in order to have a really high win rate from the blinds. But we've looked at one area in particular, which is cold calling from the blinds against a late position open generally, but we've had some early position opens as well. And we've looked at, firstly, situations where the preflop raiser c-bets, and secondly, we've looked at situations where the preflop raiser decides to check back, then how we should proceed on the turn. So hopefully if you follow the advice given in this 2-part series, then you should find that your win rate improves in this particular area of blind defense. So thanks very much for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerVIP.com.